there. So this history is so fascinating, right? History and the story of yoga, or our stories, like we all have a story to tell, and every single one of our stories is so important. It's so important that if you leave in the comments your story of how you found yoga, or how this really changed or impacted and shifted your life, you can be entered into win a session with myself as an intuitive oracle card reading, and or with Jessi as a yoga / personal training session. If you're not comfortable with leaving your story in the comment, just give like a thumb up or a heart or a hand, and send your story into our DM, and we will enter you to win this. Stories are so important. This is how we live our lives, watch TV all the time, right? Like the stories, the news is a story. Everything you see here is around a story. And the thing that's interesting about his story, or his story as opposed to her story, or just stories in general, is that with yoga, it's really more about a legend. It's the legend of yoga and what yoga is. So I like to think that it's almost kind of like a loaded question. It's sort of like when people ask me about like, how long have I been doing yoga? It's loaded because yoga isn't just one piece. And so I didn't just start practicing yoga as one thing. When I learned a down dog was probably 10 years. I can't count very well right now, but 10 years after I had learned to meditate. So in my early 20s, I studied with a Tibetan monk. I studied with somebody who was with the Karmapa, and the Karmapa is the person that looks for the next Dalai Lama. So when I was around 22 years old, I was going through a lot. I had just had 2 children in 2 years. I was in a very crazy relationship, as empaths and sociopaths often meet, and I needed some healing. So I went to sit in silence with a Buddhist monk a few times a week. It was one of the most difficult things that I ever did. But I learned how to meditate way before I learned what a down dog was. And before that, I learned about my intuition, and I already knew about chakras. I already knew about some of the more esoteric anatomy of the spirit. I learned about the anatomy of the spirit. Then I learned how to meditate. And about 7 to 10 years later, I learned what a down dog was. So it was this layered, loaded thing. So when people ask me, like, when did I start practicing yoga? I say, this lifetime. And that's kind of what it is with the history, or his story of yoga, is that the truth is we don't really know. Some people say that it's 7,000 years ago old, 8,000 years, 10,000 years, maybe 15,000 years old. And that's because we didn't really write things down. We didn't have paper and pen. We didn't have a voice memo, a phone. We weren't taking photographs of it. And it happened way out in the mountains. So the legend is that there's a legend of Shiva. And they say that Shiva, that's why we say Om Namah Shivaya, in the name of the Lord, that he is the founder of yoga. And this was possibly, 2700 AD. From him as the first yogi, he had 7 rishis. And these rishis were the holy people that were enlightened that he taught. From there, it was then, this story or this legend goes, that then we brought yoga into, the classical period around 500 to 800 BC. And that's when the yoga grew the most, with Yoga Sutras and Patanjali. And there's a post-classical period from 800 to 1700 AD. And then it was in the, mid 1900s that yoga was brought to the West. And then it was from there that it grew so much. I think there's, how many millions of people are practicing. And where I live in California, there are more people practicing yoga than in any other place in the world. And that's because of Hollywood, really. And because the yogis came there to work with the elite so that they could have a better understanding of spirituality, because spiritual people, I believe, are the people that should have money in their pockets, because that's how we're going to make a change. So the story that we tell is so important. And at the same time, is it? So it's not that it's not important or that it's not super important, but maybe somewhere in between. And that story can change, just like the story of your life can change. So I'm really curious about your yoga story. Leave it in the comments. Don't forget that we are here to help you be practically spiritual and fun, functional movement. And then I'm always here for you, whether that's on or off the bat. So I hope you have the absolute best day ever. I love you. You are so